50,000 people filled the San Paolo Stadium on a summer afternoon in 1984. The air was thick with heat and noise. Banners stretched across every section of the stands, some hand-painted, some professionally printed, all bearing the same name. Flares burned in the upper decks, smoke curling upward in slow spirals. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical, pressing against the walls, vibrating through the concrete beneath their feet. At midfield stood Diego Maradona, 23 years old, holding up a blue jersey, turning in a slow circle while the entire city screamed. He smiled, waved, lifted the shirt higher. The roar didn't fade. It deepened. It looked like celebration. It felt like something heavier. Not just welcome to Naples, more like, you're ours now. And in that moment, without a single word exchanged, the terms were quietly established. The apartment they arranged for him was in Posillipo, perched high above the bay with a view that stretched across the water. From the balcony you could see boats moving slowly toward the harbor, lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled in. It was beautiful, secluded, the kind of place that should have felt like sanctuary. But sanctuary requires permission, and permission wasn't something Naples seemed willing to grant. Within 2 days, people knew where he lived. He hadn't told anyone, hadn't mentioned it in any interview. The information just moved, passed quietly through channels he didn't understand, shared by people he'd never met. The first morning, he opened the gate and found a teenager waiting outside with a soccer ball. Maradona stopped, signed it. The kid thanked him and walked away, grinning. The next morning, there were 6 people. By the end of the week, the line stretched down the block. At first, it didn't bother him. These were fans, people who'd waited years for someone like him to arrive. Turning them away felt cruel. So he stopped every time, signed whatever they handed him, smiled for their cameras, let them take pieces of his morning. The problem was, mornings stopped being private. He'd wake up and already know they were outside. Sometimes he'd stand at the window before going down, looking at the small crowd forming on the sidewalk. There was something unsettling about being expected before you'd even decided to show up. It wasn't hostility. It was the opposite, anticipation so strong it felt like a kind of weight pressing down. That was the visible part. Training sessions were officially closed to the public. Gates locked, security posted at every entrance. But the streets around the San Paolo would fill hours before the team arrived anyway. Crowds pressed against barriers. Kids climbed walls to see over fences. By the time Maradona's car pulled up, hundreds of voices were already calling his name. He developed a routine. Step out quickly. Wave without stopping. Keep moving toward the entrance. It worked for a while, but the crowds kept growing, and growing crowds don't accept less. They demand more. Inside the facility, teammates treated him differently than players at other clubs had. There was no jealousy, no resentment, just visible relief. Like his arrival meant they could finally stop carrying something that had been too heavy to hold alone. Coaches started addressing him first during team meetings, even when the question wasn't directed at him, even when the captain was sitting 2 seats away. They'd glance at Maradona, wait for some kind of acknowledgement, then continue. Nobody planned it that way. It just became how things worked. And once something becomes routine, changing it feels like breaking a rule that was never actually written down. After training, leaving the facility took twice as long as arriving. The crowd outside had doubled. Security tried clearing a path, but people filled the space as quickly as it opened. Hands reached through gaps, not grabbing, just persistent, insistent. He'd stop for a few people, sign some autographs, pose for a couple photos. But stopping for some meant walking past others. The ones he walked past didn't forget, so he started stopping more often, which made it take longer, which turned stopping into something that no longer felt like a choice. But that wasn't the part that changed him. The real shift was quieter. It happened in the space between what he wanted to do and what he felt he couldn't refuse. The drive back to Posillipo was the only silence he got. 30 minutes alone in the back of a car, watching the city scroll past through tinted windows. Narrow streets, laundry hanging between buildings, kids kicking a ball in alleys barely wide enough to run. He'd watch them and feel something close to envy. They were playing because they wanted to. Nobody watching, nobody expecting, just movement for its own sake. He couldn't remember when it last felt that uncomplicated. Phone calls started coming in the evenings. Club officials, journalists, sponsors, always polite, always framed as requests. Could he attend a charity event, meet someone important, visit a local school? The language suggested options, but the weight behind the language made it clear there weren't really options. So he said yes, nearly every time, because saying no required explanation. And explanations took energy he didn't have after training, after crowds, after a full day of being watched. Yes was just simpler. Dinners in Chiaia became regular occurrences, restaurants where the owner greeted him like family, even though they'd only just met. The table was ready when he arrived, wine already poured, first course already on its way from the kitchen. He'd sit down and notice that small decisions had been made for him. What to drink, what to eat, where to sit, which direction to face. It felt generous at first, considerate even. But consideration that removes choice eventually starts feeling like something different. People in Naples didn't ask if he was available. They told him where to be and assumed he'd show up. A hospital visit Tuesday, a sponsor event Thursday, a local festival Sunday afternoon. When he arrived, they thanked him warmly, as if he'd volunteered his time. But volunteering requires the freedom to decline. He began noticing how often silence got interpreted as consent. Someone would mention an upcoming event. He wouldn't respond. Days later, it appeared on his schedule as confirmed. Correcting it felt awkward, like he hadn't been listening closely enough, or worse, like he didn't care. So he stopped correcting it. There were moments, brief, passing, when he'd catch himself about to say no. The word would form in his mind. He'd feel it right there, ready. But then he'd picture the disappointment, the confusion, the need to justify why this particular request was different from all the others he'd already accepted. And the moment would pass. Yes would come out instead. Automatic. It didn't feel dramatic at the time, but it accumulated. Walking through the old city used to be something he enjoyed. The energy, the life spilling out of every corner. He'd liked feeling part of it, but walking now meant stopping every block. A photo here, an autograph there, a brief exchange with someone who just needed a minute. 1 minute times 60 people turned a 15-minute walk into 2 hours. So he stayed inside more, not because he preferred it, because visibility had become labor. From the balcony at night, lights dotted the bay like scattered stars. Boats drifted slowly toward the harbor. It was quiet up there in ways the streets below never were. He'd stand there longer than necessary sometimes, just looking, letting the silence stretch. But quiet that only exists in isolation doesn't feel much like peace. Match days carried their own specific gravity. The drive to the stadium began hours before kickoff. By the time he arrived, the atmosphere was already electric. Fans lined barriers outside, leaning over, shouting before the car even slowed. In the locker room, he could feel the weight of what everyone expected, not from anything said aloud, from how teammates looked at him, how coaches built tactics around him, how the city seemed to believe winning or losing would hinge almost entirely on what he did. Warm-ups happened in front of stands already half full, thousands arriving early just to watch him stretch. He'd go through his routine, jog, touch the ball, loosen up, feeling their eyes the entire time, not cheering yet, just watching, waiting. During games, the stadium seemed to hold its breath when the ball came to him. When he lost it, the exhale sounded like disappointment, not anger, just the quiet letdown of something anticipated that didn't materialize. Afterward came obligations, press conferences, sponsor appearances, events scheduled without anyone confirming his availability. He'd sit under bright lights, answering variations of questions he'd answered dozens of times before. How does it feel to represent Naples? What does this city mean to you? Do you feel the pressure? He always said the right thing. No pressure, just gratitude. But gratitude repeated endlessly starts sounding rehearsed. Teammates began looking to him for more than football. Before important matches, they'd glance over, not for tactics, for reassurance, like his calm could anchor theirs. He gave it because refusing would have required explaining why he couldn't. And explaining felt harder than simply providing. Late calls started coming, not urgent, just checking, making sure he'd received the message about tomorrow, confirming attendance. Usually he hadn't received the message, didn't even know about the event. Saying that would have created problems. So he said yes. Calls always ended the same: gratitude, appreciation, reminders of how much it mattered. He did care. That's what made it difficult. He genuinely wanted to help, wanted to show up, wanted to be who they believed he was. But wanting to help and being required to help aren't the same thing. And that's where something irreversible began. Journalists stopped requesting interviews and started requesting access. His routine, his thoughts, the private spaces he'd tried protecting. When he set boundaries, it was framed as evasion, like privacy itself was somehow suspicious. So he gave enough to prevent them asking why he wouldn't give more. Evenings alone carried weight, not crushing, just present. The awareness that time wasn't fully his anymore, that energy was being allocated by decisions others made. He wasn't unhappy. He played for one of the world's most passionate clubs, loved by a city that had waited decades, more financially stable than his family had ever imagined. But underneath was something quieter, harder to name. The realization that admiration had become assumption, that presence had become responsibility, that agreement had become reflex. And none of it required force, just repetition, routine. The slow accumulation of moments until refusal felt impossible. Without explanations, he lacked energy to give. There were nights when he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, running through the next day's schedule in his mind. Events he didn't remember agreeing to. Appearances that had simply materialized on his calendar. He'd think about calling someone to clarify, to push back. But who would he call? And what would he say? That he was tired? That he needed space? Those weren't reasons. They were complaints. And complaining about being loved felt like ingratitude, so he'd close his eyes and tell himself it was temporary, that once the season settled, things would calm down. But the rhythm never came. Training became automatic. Not easier, just necessary baseline maintenance to prevent everything else from collapsing. Playing well kept the city satisfied. Keeping the city satisfied kept pressure manageable. He delivered, week after week. Each time, belief strengthened that he always would. Quieter neighborhoods existed where recognition came slower. It never lasted. Someone would notice, then another. The cycle would restart. Family visited occasionally. They saw strangers approach without hesitation. Schedules filling themselves. Him moving through Naples like someone belonging to everyone. They were proud. Anyone would be. They also noticed exhaustion, the automatic smile, agreeing before questions finished. Dinners happened where plans were made without his input. Events added to calendars without confirmation. Conversations assuming prior agreement to things he'd never heard mentioned. He'd sit, listen, nod, knowing resistance would cost more than he had remaining. The club needed him. Fans needed him. The city needed him. He played through minor injuries, through fatigue, through days when staying home felt impossible because it meant disappointing people. Disappointing people felt worse than physical pain. They kept telling him how fortunate he was. He kept agreeing. Questioning felt like ingratitude. So he continued, kept affirming, kept adjusting to fit the space created around him. Slowly, without formal announcement, acceptance transformed into expectation. Nothing was seized forcibly, no threats issued, no demands explicitly stated. It simply stopped being a life he controlled and became one he maintained. The boy who'd stood at midfield that summer afternoon, the one who held a jersey above his head while 50,000 people roared, hadn't lost anything dramatic in those early months. He'd just learned, gradually and quietly, that being needed by everyone meant belonging entirely to no one, not even himself. And somewhere in that learning, a door had closed, not loudly, not obviously, but closed nonetheless. The crowd that day had decided who he was, and he'd accepted it. What he didn't realize then was that acceptance, once given, becomes permanent. He adjusted. If this story left an impression on you, liking the video is enough. For future episodes, you can subscribe.